Welcome, brave souls. Before we embark on this epic Norse tale, help our clan grow stronger by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel, and sharing in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more legendary Viking stories to life. Now, let the saga begin. The wind howled across the fjord like the breath of ancient spirits, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of winter's early arrival. In the settlement of Ironhold, nestled between towering cliffs and the restless sea, the people huddled in their longhouses as the sky above began its celestial dance. Tonight was no ordinary night. The moon was slowly being devoured by shadow, an eclipse that would paint the world in an eerie twilight. Gunnar Stormson stood at the edge of the village, his weathered hands gripping the wooden fence that marked the boundary between civilization and the wild. At 43 winters, he was a man carved by both battle and sorrow, his blonde beard streaked with premature silver, his blue eyes holding depths that spoke of losses too great to name. The leather armor he wore bore the scratches and dents of countless expeditions, and the axe at his side had tasted the blood of both beast and invader. As the eclipse reached its peak, casting the world in an otherworldly crimson glow, a cry pierced the night. Not the howl of a wolf or the call of a raven, but something far more precious and vulnerable. The sound of newborn children, their voices raw with the shock of first breath, carried on the wind from the direction of the sacred grove. Gunnar's heart quickened. In all his years, he had learned to trust his instincts, and something about this night felt charged with destiny. Against the wisdom that would keep a sensible man by his hearth during such an ominous, celestial event, he grabbed his torch and ventured into the darkness beyond the village walls. The path to the grove was treacherous in the best of times, but under the eclipse's strange light, every shadow seemed to writhe with purpose. Ancient oak trees, their trunks wider than 3 men could embrace, stood like silent sentinels watching his approach. Their branches, bare with the approach of winter, created intricate patterns against the blood-red sky. As Gunnar drew closer to the source of the cries, his torch illuminated a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. There, at the base of the great oak that the village elders claimed was blessed by the All-Father himself, lay 2 infants wrapped in rough wool blankets. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old, their tiny faces red from crying, their small fists waving helplessly at the cold air. But these were no ordinary abandoned children. Even in the dim light, Gunnar could see that their hair was not the golden blonde common to his people, nor the rich brown of the southern traders. Instead, it was white as fresh snow, and their eyes, when they opened to look at him with surprising alertness, gleamed with an unusual pale blue, almost silver in the eclipse's glow. "By Thor's hammer," Gunnar whispered, kneeling beside the children. What cruel heart would leave such small ones to face the night alone? As if in response to his voice, both infants turned toward him, their cries softening to quiet whimpers. There was something in their gaze, an intelligence that seemed far too old for such young faces, that made Gunnar's breath catch in his throat. These children were different, marked by something beyond his understanding. The sound of approaching footsteps made Gunnar turn. Through the trees came Helga the Wise, the village's most respected elder and keeper of ancient knowledge. Her grey hair was braided with small bones and carved runes, and her staff clicked against the frozen ground with each step. Behind her followed 3 younger villagers, their faces pale with fear and disgust. "Step away from those cursed ones, Gunnar Stormson," Helga commanded, her voice carrying the authority of her 70 winters. "They are marked by ill fortune, born under the shadow of the eclipse, abandoned by parents who knew what evil they had brought into this world." "Evil?" Gunnar rose slowly, positioning himself protectively between the elder and the infants. "I see only children in need of warmth and care." "Look at them," spat Orm the blacksmith, one of the villagers who had followed Helga. "Hair white as bone, eyes like winter ice. No natural child of our people bears such marks. They are cursed, touched by dark forces during their birth under this unholy eclipse." The other villagers murmured their agreement, backing away from the grove as if the very air around the children was poisoned. But Gunnar knelt again, gently touching one of the infant's tiny hands. The child's fingers wrapped around his thick finger with surprising strength, and in that moment he felt something he hadn't experienced since the death of his own family in a raid 5 years prior. Hope, cursed or blessed, they are children, Gunnar said firmly. And no child deserves to die alone in the cold. Helga's eyes narrowed, and she raised her staff to point at the twins. The signs are clear, Gunnar. Born under Eclipse shadow, marked with the colors of ice and death, these are not children of our blood. They carry within them the heritage of the ancient ones, the giants of the frozen wastes. To keep them is to invite disaster upon our clan. Then let disaster come, Gunnar replied, carefully lifting both infants in his strong arms. They seemed to calm instantly at his touch, their pale eyes focusing on his face with what almost seemed like gratitude. I have faced raiders from the south, storms that could sink longships, and beasts that would make grown men weep. I do not fear the judgment of children who have done nothing but draw their first breath. The villagers exchanged worried glances, but none dared to physically challenge Gunnar. He was known throughout the settlement, not only for his skill with blade and axe, but for his unwavering sense of honor. If he had decided to protect these children, no amount of superstition would sway him. "You bring doom upon us all," Helga warned. But there was something in her ancient eyes that suggested her fear ran deeper than simple superstition. "Mark my words, Gunnar Stormson. These children will change everything. The blood of the Jotuns runs in their veins, and with it comes power that mortal men were never meant to command." "Then let it be so," Gunnar said, wrapping his cloak around the infants to shield them from the night air. "I have lost all that mattered to me once before. I will not stand by and watch innocents suffer when I have the power to prevent it." As he turned to leave the grove, the eclipse began to wane, allowing the natural moonlight to filter through the canopy once more. The twins had fallen asleep in his arms, their breathing soft and steady against his chest. Behind him, he could hear the villagers whispering among themselves, their voices carrying fear and condemnation in equal measure. The journey back to his longhouse was longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because Gunnar found himself looking down at the sleeping children with each step. They were so small, so vulnerable, yet something about them radiated a quiet strength that reminded him of the deep ice of the high mountains, beautiful, mysterious, and potentially dangerous. His home stood at the edge of the settlement, larger than most, but emptier than it had any right to be. Once, it had housed his wife and 3 children, their laughter filling the rooms, and their love warming the stones of the hearth. Now it served as a monument to his loneliness. Too large for one man, but too full of memories to abandon. Gunnar pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the familiar warmth of his hall. The fire in the central hearth had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the carved wooden pillars that supported the roof. Shields and weapons hung on the walls, trophies of his many journeys, but tonight they seemed less like symbols of victory and more like reminders of a life lived in service to war. Setting the twins carefully on the thick furs that covered his sleeping bench, Gunnar began the work of preparing for his unexpected guests. He had no experience with infants. His own children had been raised primarily by his beloved wife, but instinct and determination would have to suffice. From his stores, he retrieved goat's milk and honey, warming them carefully over the fire and testing the temperature as he had seen mothers do. The twins woke as he approached, their pale eyes tracking his movements with an alertness that continued to unsettle him. When he offered them the milk in small amounts, they accepted it eagerly, their tiny hands reaching toward him with trust that both humbled and terrified him. "What name shall you bear, little ones?" he murmured as they fed. "Your birth parents gave you nothing but life and abandonment, so the choosing falls to me." He studied their faces in the firelight. Though twins, they were not identical. The boy, born first, if the size difference was any indication, had features that would likely grow sharp and defined, with a jaw that promised strength and eyes that held a hint of winter storms. The girl, smaller but no less alert, bore a gentler cast to her features, though her gaze held the same otherworldly intelligence as her brother. "You, young warrior," Gunnar said to the boy, "shall be called Ingvar, after the god of fertility and peace, for I pray you will bring both to our troubled world." He turned to the girl, touching her soft white hair with wonder. "And you, little shield maiden, shall be Solveig, sun's strength, for even in the darkness of your birth you shine with inner light." As if in response to their naming, both children made soft sounds that might have been approval or simply contentment at being warm and fed. Gunnar arranged the furs to create a safe nest for them beside his own sleeping place, close enough that he could hear their breathing and respond to their needs. But sleep did not come easily that night. As the twins rested peacefully beside him, Gunnar stared up at the smoke hole in the roof, watching the stars wheel overhead and contemplating the magnitude of what he had done. He had defied the wisdom of his elders, ignored the fears of his neighbors, and taken responsibility for two children, who might indeed carry within them powers beyond mortal understanding. Outside, the wind continued to howl across the fjord, and somewhere in that sound Gunnar could swear he heard whispers, not of spirits or ancestors, but of something far older and more primal. The voice of the ancient ice, perhaps, welcoming its children home. 15 years had passed since the night of the eclipse, and the twins had grown into young adults who bore little resemblance to the helpless infants Gunnar had found in the sacred grove. Ingvar stood tall and lean, his white hair now reaching past his shoulders and often braided in the warrior fashion. Though he had yet to see true battle, his pale blue eyes held depths of thought that made him seem older than his years, and his hands, though still young, showed the calluses of sword and axe training under his adoptive father's guidance. Solveig had blossomed into a young woman of striking beauty, but it was a cold beauty, like sunlight on fresh snow. Her white hair flowed like spun silver, and her movements carried a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Where her brother was contemplative, she was intuitive, often knowing things before they were spoken, and sensing changes in weather or mood that others missed entirely. The village of Ironhold had grown accustomed to their presence over the years, though never truly comfortable with it. Children who had once whispered and pointed now treated the twins with the wary respect due to any member of Gunnar's household, but the adults still crossed themselves with protective gestures when the twins passed by. On this particular morning, the autumn air carried more than the usual chill. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the seabirds that normally filled the sky with their cries had taken shelter, leaving an ominous silence broken only by the crash of increasingly violent waves against the rocky shore. Gunnar stood in the training yard behind his longhouse, watching with pride as Ingvar practiced the complex sword forms he had learned over the years. The young man's movements were fluid and precise, each strike and parry executed with the kind of natural skill that took most warriors decades to develop. But there was something else in Ingvar's technique, something that made the air around his blade seem to shimmer with cold. "Hold," Gunnar called, stepping forward with his own practice sword. "You're letting your emotions guide the blade rather than your training. In true combat, that passion will get you killed." Ingvar lowered his weapon, breathing heavily from exertion. "I'm sorry, father. My mind keeps wandering to the stories the traders brought yesterday. News of raids along the southern settlements, villages burned, people taken as thralls." "Aye, troubling news indeed," Gunnar acknowledged, settling into his own fighting stance. "But worry serves no purpose except to cloud judgment. Show me the eagle's strike sequence and keep your thoughts on the present moment." As they began their sparring session, Solveig emerged from the longhouse, carrying a wooden bucket toward the well. Her daily tasks had expanded over the years to include managing much of the household, a role she performed with quiet efficiency despite never having been formally taught. She possessed an intuitive understanding of healing herbs, could predict weather changes days in advance, and had an uncanny ability to soothe both humans and animals with nothing more than her presence. The morning practice session was interrupted by the sound of a horn echoing across the fjord. 3 long blasts that made every person in the village stop what they were doing and look toward the sea. It was the warning call for approaching ships, but the pattern indicated something more urgent than simple traders or returning fishermen. Gunnar and Ingvar immediately ceased their training and joined the stream of villagers hurrying toward the harbor. From their elevated position, they could see what had prompted the alarm. A dozen longships approaching rapidly from the south, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the rough water with predatory grace. These were not the sleek vessels of their own people, but the broader, more heavily armed ships favored by the southern clans. Raiders, Gunnar muttered, his experienced eye taking in the details that confirmed his worst fears. The ships flew the banners of the Bloodcrow clan, notorious for their brutal tactics and their practice of taking entire communities as thralls. They've come north seeking easier prey than the fortified southern towns. Helga the Wise appeared beside them, her ancient frame somehow managing to keep pace despite her age. "This is the doom I warned you of, Gunnar Stormson," she said, her voice carrying no satisfaction at being proven right, only weary resignation. "The children you saved have drawn darkness to our shores." "The only darkness I see comes from those ships," Gunnar replied sharply, "and we'll meet it as our ancestors did, with steel and courage." But even as he spoke, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The timing seemed too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the twins reaching maturity. Could there be truth in the old woman's warnings after all? The village erupted into organized chaos as the alarm spread. Warriors ran to don their armor and gather their weapons, while women and children began the well-practiced routine of securing valuables and preparing defensible positions. Ironhold was not a wealthy settlement, but it was strategically positioned and well defended, with high palisades and a harbor that could be easily blocked. As Gunnar hurried back to his longhouse to retrieve his war gear, he found both twins already preparing for battle. Ingvar was strapping on the leather armor Gunnar had made for him, while Solveig was gathering supplies and weapons with swift efficiency. "You will both stay in the longhouse during the fighting," Gunnar commanded, buckling on his own mail shirt. "Bar the doors and protect the younger children who will be brought here for safety." "Father," Ingvar protested, his pale eyes flashing with determination, "I have trained for 15 years. I will not cower while you and the others risk their lives. And I will not lose you to satisfy your pride," Gunnar snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "You are skilled, my son, but this will not be a training bout. These are veteran killers who show no mercy." Solveig stepped forward, her voice calm despite the tension filling the air. "Father, I've been having dreams about this day. The ice calls to us, to both of us. We cannot hide from what we are meant to become." The words sent a chill down Gunnar's spine. Over the years, both twins had occasionally demonstrated abilities that seemed to confirm Helga's warnings about their otherworldly heritage. Small things mostly. An unusual ability to withstand cold that would numb other people, an intuitive understanding of weather patterns, and an almost supernatural skill with weapons despite their youth. The sound of horns grew closer, and through the window they could see the first of the raider ships entering the harbor. These were hardened warriors from the southern fjords, men who had built their reputations on violence and conquest. Their leader, a giant of a man named Thorvald the Cruel, was said to have never lost a raid or shown mercy to those who opposed him. "Promise me," Gunnar said urgently, grabbing both twins by the shoulders, "that you will not leave this house unless the walls themselves are breached. Your safety matters more to me than my own life." Both young people nodded solemnly, but Gunnar could see in their eyes the same stubborn determination that had led him to defy the village elders 15 years earlier. They would follow his wishes only until their conscience or circumstances demanded otherwise. The battle for Ironhold began at midday, when the first wave of raiders hit the beach like a breaking storm. Gunnar fought at the front of the village's defensive line, his axe singing through the air as it had in countless battles before. But these southern warriors were different from the usual raiders, better organized, more ruthless, and seemingly endless in number. From the longhouse window, Ingvar and Solveig watched the fighting with growing alarm. The village's defenders were skilled and brave, but they were outnumbered nearly 3-1. Slowly, inexorably, the raiders were pushing through the outer defenses and into the heart of the settlement. "We have to help them," Ingvar said, his knuckles white as he gripped his sword hilt. "Father cannot hold them all." Solveig placed a hand on her brother's arm, and both twins felt it immediately, a strange coldness that seemed to flow between them, accompanied by whispers in a language they had never learned but somehow understood. The voice of the ancient ice, calling them to embrace their true heritage. "Look," Solveig whispered, pointing toward the harbor where more raider ships were beaching themselves. "They're not just here to raid, they're here to take the entire village." As if to confirm her words, they could see raiders moving systematically through the settlement, not just fighting, but herding civilians toward the ships. This was not a simple raid for gold and goods. This was enslavement on a massive scale. The sound of splintering wood drew their attention back to the immediate danger. The longhouse door, which had seemed so solid moments before, was beginning to buckle under the assault of 3 raiders who had broken through the village's defenses. In seconds, they would be inside. Ingvar raised his sword and stepped in front of his sister, but Solveig moved to stand beside him rather than behind him. As they faced the imminent threat, both twins felt the same sensation, a power awakening within them that had slumbered since their birth under the eclipsed moon. The door exploded inward, and 3 savage warriors burst into the longhouse with weapons raised and victory cries on their lips. But their triumph turned to confusion, then fear, as they found themselves facing not cowering villagers, but 2 young people whose pale eyes had begun to glow with an inner light. The temperature in the room plummeted so rapidly that their breath became visible, and frost began forming on the wooden walls. Ingvar's sword blade became sheathed in ice that gleamed like crystal, while the air around Solveig began to swirl with patterns of snow that defied the absence of any wind. "What sorcery is this?" one of the raiders gasped, but his words were cut short as Ingvar moved with speed that seemed impossible for a mortal youth. The ice-covered blade sang through the air, and where it touched, the raider's weapon shattered like brittle wood. Solveig raised her hand, and the swirling snow coalesced into shapes that struck the remaining raiders with the force of hammer blows, driving them to their knees. The power flowing through both twins was intoxicating and terrifying. They could feel the strength of the ancient ice, the patient fury of glaciers, and the inexorable power of winter itself. But as quickly as it had come, the power faded, leaving them gasping and weak. The raiders lay unconscious at their feet, their weapons destroyed, and their bodies covered with a thin layer of frost that was already beginning to melt. What just happened to us?" Ingvar asked, staring at his now normal sword with wonder and fear. Before Solveig could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of more danger. Through the broken doorway stepped a figure that made both twins' blood run cold. Thorvald the Cruel himself, drawn by reports of strange magic being used against his men. He was even larger than the stories suggested, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks and a beard braided with the finger bones of his enemies. His eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had never known defeat, and the massive war hammer in his hands bore stains that spoke of countless victories. "So," he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder, "the village harbors ice witches. No wonder my men spoke of unnatural cold and weapons that shattered like glass." The twins stood together, exhausted from their first taste of their inherited power, but refusing to show fear. Solveig stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the terror she felt. "Leave this place, southern dog. Take your ships and your men and never return, or face the wrath of the ancient ice." Thorvald laughed, a sound like breaking stone. "Brave words, child, But whatever parlor tricks you've learned will not save you from the edge of my hammer." He raised his weapon, and both twins prepared for what might be their final battle. But before the raider chief could strike, another voice cut through the tension, older, deeper, and carrying an authority that made even Thorvald pause. "Hold, mortal! These children are under my protection." The ancient pact between the children of ice and the sons of fire had been forgotten by most, relegated to myth and legend. But on that day in Ironhold, when two young people embraced their true heritage for the first time, the old agreement stirred to life once more. The raiders retreated, but not in defeat. They carried with them news that would spread across all the northern kingdoms. The twin children of the eclipse had awakened, and with them, powers that had slumbered since the world was young. Some would call them saviors, others would name them harbingers of a new age of ice and darkness. But in the longhouse of Gunnar Stormson, they remained what they had always been. Beloved children, whose destiny was only beginning to unfold. The greatest adventures and the greatest dangers still lay ahead. Thank you for joining us on this epic Norse journey. If you enjoyed this tale of the Eclipse Twins and their awakening power, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more legendary Viking stories, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. What did you think of Ingvar and Solveig's first manifestation of their inherited abilities? Share your thoughts below, and we'll see you in the next saga.